Hello, my name is Jane Goodall. I'm 87 years old and this is my story. I have always been interested in animals, and I think if you look after animals, it's important that you know a little bit about how they work. You know, what makes them tick. But I never thought that I would be the sort of person that would work with animals professionally. My father, when I was born, said, "Oh, no, not another animal lover," because I had already started rescuing creatures around me. I didn't want to be a scientist. I wanted to work with animals. It wasn't really an option for girls in those days. You either got married or you took a job as a secretary. And I could type, but I wasn't very good at anything else. My mother was a secretary, and so she encouraged me. She said, "Well, why don't you just get some secretarial work experience, and then you can come back to secretarial college next September." So I found myself a job as a secretary's assistant in a rather large firm in London, and I hated it. And I remember sitting at my desk thinking, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to live in Africa? And I took out the Reader's Digest and opened it at random, and there was an article about Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. And I thought, that's where I want to go. I went to National Geographic, and I asked if I could borrow some books about Olduvai Gorge. I borrowed 3 books, read them cover to cover, and then I knew everything about Olduvai Gorge and the people who were working there. So I wrote to Louis Leakey. I wrote to him several times. I got no answer. Then I wrote to his wife, Mary Leakey, and she was so busy excavating at Olduvai Gorge that she also didn't have time to write me an answer. So I wrote to Louis again, and finally, he wrote back saying, "You seem to know quite a lot about our work. Why don't you come out and work with us for a month or 2 and see if you like it?" And I arrived at the end of July in 1960. We followed the tracks of the chimpanzees until we came to a clearing. And Louis said, "There's our camp." And I looked and I thought, but there's nothing here. There are some sticks. There's a piece of string on a rock. There's a saucepan hanging on a tree. There's a bit of a wall made of stones. This is hardly a camp. And I soon discovered that Louis and Mary Leakey had gone off to Chicago to give a lecture tour. And I was left alone with only a cook called Job and our driver, a man called Adam. And I sat down and I started looking through the book that Louis had lent me about chimpanzees. And there was a photograph of a chimpanzee stripping leaves off a twig to dip into a termite mound. And I thought, oh, chimps are supposed to do that. And I closed the book and I picked up my binoculars and I looked up in the trees, and there was a chimp doing exactly that. Louis Leakey had a theory about human origins. He believed that we had evolved from apes in Africa, and he thought that perhaps the missing link was still there. He believed that these creatures would show us the way. He gave me a pair of binoculars and he said, watch them closely. Try to find out what they're doing. And I watched them day after day after day, week after week after week. And eventually I got a notebook and I started recording things that I had never seen before. Things like chimpanzees passing leaves to each other in the trees, chimpanzees kissing, grooming, playing. It was during those early days that I saw a young chimp coming down the trees towards us, walking onto legs. And he was carrying a stick. He came right up to me and put the stick down at my feet. And he looked at me expectantly, and I stared at him and I thought, what does he want? And he picked up the stick and he started hitting the ground with it and screaming. And I suddenly realized that he wanted me to follow him. He was inviting me to play, and I learned that chimps have emotions. They have things in common with us. We have a lot in common. Chimpanzees use tools. I was lucky enough to spend many years with my research group watching chimpanzees in the forest, seeing how they lived, getting to know them as individuals, finding out about their social lives, watching how they hunted bush babies and how they ate their prey. We saw all sorts of new things. We saw them making fishing spears, we saw them building nests, and we saw them grieve over their dead. And I suppose the most exciting thing was to discover that chimpanzees kill and eat meat. No one had ever seen that before. I remember the first time that I saw chimps killing. It was a terrible shock. I was observing a chimp called Flo, and she suddenly climbed up a tree and disappeared into the foliage. A few minutes later, I heard screams, and I knew those screams. I had heard them before when a leopard was in the area, and I thought, oh, no, a leopard has got her. But when I got to the bottom of that tree, I found Flo standing on the ground kicking and screaming and holding a baby warthog in her hands. So I suddenly realized that the screams that I had heard were the screams of the warthog, not the screams of a leopard. And I realized that chimpanzees weren't gentle vegetarian herbivores. They were ruthless killers, and I wondered, am I now going to get killed by chimps? Am I going to be attacked by them? And I decided then and there that I must learn more about them. I must get closer to them. I must understand their emotions, their behavior, what makes them tick. I saw male chimps killing young chimps. I saw adult females being dragged off into the bushes by the males to mate with them. And I learned that chimps aren't gentle vegetarian herbivores. They are ruthless killers. And I realized that the line between humans and animals isn't as clear-cut as some people think. I was the first person to call a chimp a he or a him. Before that, people referred to adult male chimps as boars and adult female chimps as sows. And I thought, no, I'm calling him David Greybeard. I'm calling her Florence. I'm calling him Ike. I'm calling her Flint. When the forest started disappearing and the chimps started disappearing with it, I became much more involved in trying to stop the destruction of the forest. When the Tanzanian government asked me if I would like to run a national park, I said, yes, but I don't know anything about running a national park. And they said, don't worry, we'll teach you. And I learned that I could make a difference. I learned that I could influence people. I could use my experiences with the chimpanzees to help not only the chimpanzees, but the people around them. And I've continued to do that ever since. The threats facing the chimpanzees are the same as the threats facing us. And if we're going to deal with those threats, we have to deal with our attitudes. People have this extraordinary idea that somehow we've been put on this planet to rule over all the other creatures. And if we just stop and think about that for a second, we realize how ridiculous that is. Here we are, this tiny species, ruling over all the other creatures, including some of the cleverest creatures on the planet, chimps and dolphins. For too long, we've done whatever we want to animals, to the land, to the water. And it's only now that we're restarting to realize that we're part of the natural world. And if we want to survive, we have to respect the natural world. And that's what my institute tries to teach people. That's what Roots and Shoots tries to teach young people. If we all take responsibility, then we can solve the problems. And I've been doing this for 62 years. I've met some wonderful people who've been inspired by what they've learned about the natural world. I've met them in every country of the world. And I've realized that if people care, if people feel inspired, if people have hope, then we can make a difference. I try to tell people about the wonders of nature, the beauty, the magic, and the fact that we can make a difference. People sometimes say to me, how can you be so cheerful? You must get so depressed when you think about the state of the world. And I say, if I thought that, I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. I know that we're in a mess, and I know that we've caused this mess. But I believe that we can sort it out, and I've spent a lifetime trying to instill that belief in other people, showing them that we can make a difference if we all work together. Sometimes I get tired and I wonder whether I'll ever stop traveling, whether I'll ever stop talking. But then I meet young people like you, and I know that it will continue because you carry the future in your hands. I think that if you listen to the voices of the wild, you'll hear